the brink of losing that forever. So how about number 2, storing value? So it used to be if you wanted to store large amounts of value, unless it was under your mattress, you needed to do so at a bank or recognized FI. But of course now Bitcoin has given us an offering. It's given us a place to store value. And we're noticing now all these new kinds of decentralized applications and regular applications which are allowing us to interface more easily with the world of crypto assets. So you can now store assets on hardware wallets, you can do so using multi-factor authentication, you can do so using multi-signature wallets, and you can just decide to own private keys. So that form of self-sovereignty in terms of holding and storing value is deeply liberating, and it's especially true if you live in a part of the world where the banks are arbitrarily shutting down access to capital, like they've done in Lebanon for the past 2 weeks. Moving value. So the systems we have in place, things like SWIFT and Fed and the ACH system in the United States, are basically built on technology from the 1970s. Well, we're entering into this period where all of a sudden we're allowing the industry to open up to new forms of technology. So Bitcoin is terrific if you want to store value in Bitcoin all the time, and if you want to move large amounts of money, and you don't need to do it instantaneously. If you need to do it in 20, 30 minutes, maybe a few hours, and you're looking to move 20, 30 grand or more, there's no more efficient way to do that in the world than with Bitcoin. But not all forms of moving value globally are like that, right? And now we're seeing the rise of stablecoins as sort of the perfect example of open finance. So stablecoins are not truly decentralized. They're a digital facsimile that represents some value that's held in some other kind of asset. Stable only if your frame of mind is in that asset. So it could be gold, it could be fiat currency like the US dollar. The value of Tether that's moved around the world has recently, on a day-to-day basis, surpassed the value of Bitcoin. And of course, with projects like Libra and others, the door is about to be blown wide open on that. Lending value. Again, for all of human history, all lending has generally taken place, if it's done at scale, through a traditional financial intermediary. But now, if everyone has access to their own sovereign identity, which can be a far more reliable measure of your creditworthiness and your authenticity as a person, you don't need to necessarily have a credit score to get access to a loan. We can connect peer-to-peer in a trustless way. Funding and investing. So before I entered into this industry, I used to work in investment banking, and for a middle market investment bank in Canada called Canaccord Genuity. And our job was basically to connect growth companies with sources of capital, sources of risk capital. And the way that this has always kind of worked is a multi-step process. So step 1, you start your little company, you get access to seed funding or angel funding. Then you do a Series A, then you do a Series B, then you do a Series C, then you do a Series D, and then you go bankrupt. No, only if you're reworking. No, then you go public, hopefully, if it's going according to plan. And then once you're a public company, you have access to more capital markets, which allows you to raise more money, and so on and so forth. And this is a system that's worked really well, but it's one which we've noticed recently is showing signs of changing. So the ICO boom that happened in 2017 and 2018 is instructive in a lot of ways. There's a famous quote, I can't remember, it was maybe Jacques Chirac was asked, who was the president of France, what do you think of the French Revolution? Was it a positive or a negative for the people of France? And he replied, 200 years later, it's too early to tell. I think the same thing is true of the ICO boom, right? I mean, there's a lot of good and there's a lot of bad. The bad is that I think a lot of projects were issuing a token to raise money to grow their business, right? So in essence, those kinds of tokens were securities. But because there was no way to easily define them, they had to sort of backwards engineer this utility use case into their token, which ultimately made no sense and led to a lot of projects which I think were designed poorly from the outset. I'm not saying all of them, I'm saying some of them. But I think what it did demonstrate is that if you're an entrepreneur with a compelling idea, you can access a global pool of capital, and you can do so peer-to-peer in a seamless way. So all of a sudden, the traditional barriers, geographical and otherwise, which have confined capital into countries, cities, regions, broke down and disappeared. And as a result, helped to give us a window, just a glimpse into what the future could look like, where we live in a decentralized world where it doesn't matter if you're in Karachi or if you're in Lagos, Nigeria, or whatever. If you have a compelling idea and a compelling product and you can market it effectively, you can raise growth capital. And that means a decline in the relevance of specific geographies in terms of the future of innovation. And it needs a more democratized financial world for entrepreneurs. And these are other kinds of crypto assets in a taxonomy, which I'll get to in a second. So the next one is exchanging value. So I'll go back to the slide for a second. I think a lot of people look at the world of crypto assets, this long tail of shit coins, or whatever they're called, and says, these are all currencies. Why on earth would you need a bunch of tiny little currencies? Surely the more you have, the more friction there is. I mean, look at the way the world works today. Every nation state more or less has its own currency. The system works terribly. We should all just use Bitcoin. And I think actually when it comes to currencies as a use case, in terms of the moving of value, there's a lot of merit to that. But I think the important thing is that not all crypto assets are designed to be currencies. And so what we did in the second edition of the book was try and design a taxonomy that explained what exactly these things are and where they'll be useful. So currencies are designed to be a medium of exchange, a store of value, and a unit of account. Bitcoin, Monero, Zcash, etc. Protocol tokens or platforms are designed to be open networks where you can build and run applications, decentralized applications, Ethereum, EOS, Cardano, Cosmos, etc. Utility tokens, again, this is what a lot of projects did during the ICO stage. I think there frankly are few use cases for utility tokens, though I think there are some, are designed basically to be native digital assets that exist inside an application and allow you to access the services. And the more useful that application becomes, the more valuable those tokens become. That's a wait and see story as far as I'm concerned. Number 4, securities tokens. Native digital assets that represent some form of traditional financial asset. So people talk about tokenizing real estate and oil and all these things, and I think there's definitely some value to that. But I think the most obvious application of blockchain for securities is where it's basically only contract-based and where it settles to cash. So a stock is a very good example of that. A stock, a share in a company, is just a contract. It entitles the bearer, the owner of that contract, to a share of a common enterprise and certain rights, like the right to receive dividends if the company pays it, the right to attend shareholder meetings, the right to vote in proxies, and so on and so forth. All of that is more or less just a figment of the human imagination, which is infinitely creative. And all of that contract and language can be digitized. So if you look at the value of the crypto asset ecosystem today, it's $250 billion. That's meaningful in size. If it were a public company, it might be the 20th largest in the world. But it's a tiny fraction compared to the global equities market, which is worth around $100 trillion. And of course, equities are just one of dozens of different securities where this technology can be applied. So just to go through the last couple, natural asset tokens, of course, are what I described earlier, tokens that represent a claim on some physical asset. I think there's some usefulness there to improve efficiencies, but I do think they're limited by the fact that there's still a physical delivery. There's a meme on the internet like, what problems can't Bitcoin solve? Well, one of the problems they can't solve is like you got to deliver a barrel of oil or a bunch of pork bellies to someone. Crypto doesn't solve that part of the value chain. Collectibles, I think we know about, and then of course, fiat, cryptos, and stable coins. So, just to go through these last two here. So ensuring value and managing risk. So there's all sorts of decentralized insurance markets that are popping up, and there's a few examples of them here, which allow you to use a sovereign identity, which is embedded with information which is extremely useful, to basically price an insurance policy. And where we see a lot of this happening is in the intersection of the Internet of Things and blockchain technology. So two cars can get into a car accident, each of them can have their own sovereign identity, the vehicles themselves. And based on sensors, they could decide in an instant whether or not one party was at fault, what the estimate was of the damage was, and to execute a transaction peer-to-peer, all without engaging an agent or any of the traditional people. So that's just a tiny bit of scratching the surface of what this can do for insurance. Analyzing value. I think this is actually an area where so far our industry has failed. I think that the quality of information in this industry is very poor. But there are examples of companies that are making big improvements in this. Masari is one in particular that I would recommend you take a look at. And then accounting, always a sexy topic. The way that we do accounting today is based on this system called double entry bookkeeping. So double entry bookkeeping was developed by a mathematician who was a friend of Leonardo da Vinci. His name was Luca Pacioli. And he basically devised the system for the merchants of Florence. at the time. So, businesses were becoming more complicated, trade was growing, and there needed to be a way to organize financial information. So he said for every transaction, there will be a debit and a credit, and in the end, those things will balance, which is why we call it a balance sheet. And this is probably one of the most important human innovations of all time, because the ability to organize financial information led, of course, to the rise of the joint stock corporation and to sort of the modern economy and modern bureaucracy as we know it. None of that would have been possible. Having said that, as an innovation, it's 500 years old. So how come we haven't figured out a way to improve how we think about organizing financial information? So the big innovation for blockchain is this idea of triple entry bookkeeping, where in addition to a debit and a credit, you have a third entry that would go to a immutable ledger that would be trusted and would be permanent, and that all stakeholders could agree was accurate. So if you want to ask, a treasurer, an accountant, or a CFO inside of a corporation, what's going on in my company? He'll say, I have no idea. Ask me in 3 months when we report. If you want to go to the marketing department, you say, how are our sales going on, Instagram, through our Shopify account? They can tell you in an instant. So finance is one of those strange artifacts that really has not changed. So with triple entry bookkeeping, you can see in real time everything that's happening inside of an organization, the movement of cash, the payments of bills, of lading, of receivables, and everything else. So fascinating as it is, the first the first central bank digital currency was the petro. Everyone remembers that. Not really sure how that's going. That thing had a few things going against it. Number one, they said it was backed by oil. There's no evidence of that. Number two, they said it was based on a blockchain. There's no evidence of that. And number three, you're relying on a kleptocratic regime to manage the currency. And we know how that worked before the blockchain came along. But what's interesting about it is that this has become top of mind, and it's not just for dictators and demagogues. It's top of mind for the most important people on the planet. And interestingly enough, it was the Libra initiative, which I think helped to light a fire under a lot of central bankers. So this is a gentleman by the name of Mark Carney. Mark Carney is the governor of the Bank of England. He's a Canadian citizen. And he gave this speech at Jackson Hole, Wyoming, during the big confab that all the central bankers go to in August of this year. Now, everyone at the time was focused on whether or not the Fed was going to cut rates, and then of course you may remember Trump went on this absolute Twitter tirade, which sunk the market by 1,000 points. None of that actually matters. All that stuff will be forgotten. The thing that should matter to everyone is what he said in his speech. He said, the days of the US dollar as the global reserve currency are numbered, and that's a good thing. It's a good thing because the US dollar is the foundation of all trade and all commerce globally, even though the US economy is a small fraction of the global economy, and most trade happens between countries that never touches the US banking system, never touches the US economy. And what he advocated for was a synthetic hegemonic currency. So he said, maybe it'll look like Libra, but probably it's better off in the hands of governments. Now, he's a central banker, so that, of course, is going to be his position. And we'll see how this all plays out. Libra, as an initiative, I think if it's allowed to proceed, and that's a big if, is almost guaranteed to be a massive commercial success. Now, I'm not saying that's going to be a big success by other metrics, like is it good for society or is it good for the world? I think that's a more complicated question. But basically, this is an opportunity for Facebook to create a simple, easy digital medium for value that can be used by 2.45 billion people. So if 1/10 of the users of Facebook start using Libra, and there's a lot of evidence to suggest that they would, Libra and Facebook would be the biggest bank in the world. They would be 5 times as large as JP Morgan. They would have 250 million customers. So predictably, governments are up in arms about this. The US, it's hard to figure out what exactly Congress wants out of this other than an opportunity to use Facebook as a punching bag. There is a little bit of silver lining to everything that went down this summer during those hearings, which is that, if anything, the issue that people took in Congress with Libra, it's not Facebook's Libra, but they're the driving force behind it, wasn't about crypto, it was about Facebook. Facebook was the problem. And in fact, one representative said, Bitcoin is a much better alternative. It's decentralized, it's not controlled by one company. Why don't we just support that? So we'll see how this works out. Regardless of whether or not Facebook launches on time, or if it even launches at all, I think the genie's been kind of let out of the bottle. I think that at this stage, if you're a big company and you've got a consumer base in the hundreds of millions or billions of people, you have an opportunity to control the fundamental financial rails that will help to underpin the next era of the digital age. You know, I'm sure Jeff Bezos doesn't want people spending Libra inside of Amazon, right? In the same way that Microsoft spent billions of dollars to try and unseat Google and Chrome with Bing and the Internet Explorer, we'll see likewise in these different companies. So the war over the future of money is just beginning. Now, I'm not going to dwell on this for too long, but beyond financial services, there are a dozen or more applications and business models which can be enabled, and this is just a few examples of that. And I wish I could talk about it, but in the interest of time, I'm going to move ahead. So there are a lot of reasons why this technology could be successful. There are also a lot of reasons why it might not. And success can be measured in different kinds of ways. You know, does it fail to launch and does it sputter out? I think at this point we're kind of beyond that stage. I think we're too far along, and the value is so self-evident that this technology will continue to have a greater role in the world. But the bigger question is, how will it be used and to what ends? You know, technology does not have moral agency. It is not good and it's not bad. It's a tool. And a tool, like any tool, depends on who's using it and for what ends. So if you have a spear, you can use it to kill an animal to feed your family. You can also use it to kill an enemy. You know, you invent fire. You can use it to warm your hearth, to paint on the walls of a cave, or you can use it to burn and scorch the lands of your enemies. So all technology tools from the beginning of human time have been used for good and for bad. So let's talk about a couple of these. Powerful incumbents of the old paradigm will usurp it. I'm not sure that's necessarily a bad thing. If big companies are using this technology, it's obviously a big validation, but it could be twisted and used in the wrong kinds of ways. A bigger one would be governments. So I think that the issue here is, strangely, that we've got a crisis with government in the US and a crisis with government in China. They're just vastly different. In the US, the issue is that, for whatever reason, Congress has lost taste, and the government has lost a taste for innovation. And as a result, it can mean the US cedes leadership around critical issues for the future, like blockchain, to their adversaries elsewhere. In China, the issue is fundamentally different. You know, the attributes about this technology that we like to promote and that we talk about, you know, the openness, they're decentralized, they're private, all of these things would be inverted if the Chinese yuan or other form of payment system were to be created. It would become the biggest tool of social control and government surveillance that's ever been devised in human history. It would make the Great Firewall of China look like kid stuff. Another big issue is that there are a lot of leaders of the old paradigm who still have trouble embracing the new. And when you have one of these paradigm shifts, it's often met with hostility or derision. It's often dismissed, and we've seen this in our industry from time to time. But we've also seen it in many, many other industries. And generally speaking, it happens when we're during one of these epochal shifts, the invention of television, the invention of radio, the crisis of confidence in democracy during the rise of fascism in the 1930s. There are people who are naysayers to all sorts of big shifts that take place in the world. And all you can do is to just keep building. Success is the best form of revenge. On the regulation front, we want to be careful because on one hand, you want governments to become knowledgeable, to interface with private enterprise, to try and work with them to come up with solutions. But on the other hand, you don't want them to rush to create rules. So the bit license in New York is a good example of this. This was something that unnecessarily duplicated the regulatory burden for startups and that caused a lot of them to leave town. During the rise of the first automobiles, there were these laws which were created in London, England. They're called red flag laws. And basically, the idea was if you had one of these self-powered locomotives, these cars, you needed to have at least 3 people to operate them. You needed a driver, you needed a spotter, and you needed a red flag man. And the purpose of the red flag man would be to walk in front of a car like this, waving a red flag. The idea being that the most important constituents on the roads weren't people and cars, they were horses. And horses would be terrified of this bizarre new contraption. So if you think about the benefits of an automobile, I don't know, like freedom and autonomy and the ability to go fast, those are kind of negated by having a guy walk in front of your car waving a freaking red flag. So I think that a lot of the new rules that get created in this industry are like red flag laws. They kind of have good intentions, but fundamentally all they do is handicap innovation. So for a major new report that we just released and will be included in my next book, which comes out in January, we did a little thought experiment. What would the world look like in 2030? How would things be different? You know, I mentioned earlier that I think of this technology as this unstoppable force, which is coming head on against this immovable object. And the cataclysm, the explosion that occurs is going to be significant, but it's not necessarily good or bad. In this thought experiment, we basically said, well, we know this now, that the Chinese are going to create this form of digital cash. I don't know if it's on a blockchain, decentralized, I doubt it, but it'll use some of the attributes of this technology, and it'll be used as an instrument for social control and for surveillance. And they will also use it as a way to export the Chinese economic model to places like Africa, Eastern Europe, and along the new Silk Road, the Belt and Road project. And it'll basically be a challenge to the US dollar. So the US dollar and the US government will have to react, and so I think we'll see that get digitized. I think that private corporations issuing their own coins is going to become increasingly popular. Facebook, Libra might get canceled, but when Alibaba or Tencent or someone else decides to create their own, not with the resistance of the government, but with the active support of the government, I think the US is going to wake up. And so I think this is an inevitability as well. There are good parts of that and bad parts of that. There are more people with a Facebook account in large parts of the world than a bank account. So this has become an easy way for them to get access to the nuts and bolts of financial services. It also makes them servants to corporate oligopolies, which you can pull out of a country at any notice and are not accountable to citizens the way they are in a democracy. So, and of course, Bitcoin will always be the third option. It will always be an alternative. And I think as a result, it will become increasingly popular as well. So this is a world that could be more interconnected, more efficient. It could be one where governments have more control, where freedoms are subsumed. The ultimate thing when it comes to looking out 20 years into the future, 10 years in the future, is to remember that it's fun to do these thought experiments, but the future is not something to be predicted. The future is something to be achieved. And everybody is here because they want to be part of building what that new future can look like. And so we can decide for ourselves whether or not the future is one that's full of hope or one that's fraught with peril. And I'll end on this note. There's another parable about the invention of chess, maybe Chinese in origin, Indian in origin. No one can say for sure. Where the king of the land, the emperor, is so pleased with this new game in the court, chess, that he says, I will offer the inventor whatever he wants, whatever his heart desires, as a reward. And the inventor says, oh, sire, you're very kind, but I'm just a humble man with humble needs. All I wish is for some rice to feed my family. But I'd like for you to give it to me in this way. I would like you to put 1 grain of rice on the first piece of the chessboard, 2 grains of rice on the second, 4 on the third, 8 on the fourth, and so on and so forth. And the king, who I gather is like not a math guy, says, sure, whatever, how much rice can that be? A barrel of rice, a bag of rice? What a humble request from a humble man. Of course, 8 becomes 16, becomes 32, becomes 64, and so on. So by halfway through the chessboard, it's more rice than the entire kingdom can produce in a year. By the end of the chessboard, it's enough rice to cover the entire planet in 2 meters of rice. Sorry, for our Americans, 6 feet of rice. 6.5 feet of rice. There's a corollary to that story, of course, which is the king gets very pissed off and chops the guy's head off. That's not going to happen to us, I don't think. But it's worth recognizing that technology follows these power laws. It grows exponentially. The first era of industrialization in the first digital age took us to the middle of the chessboard. The world is very different than it was 50 years ago or even 25 years ago. Just imagine what the next half is going to look like. So all I can say is thank you very much for your time and join the blockchain revolution if you haven't already. Thank you.